The morning sun cast long shadows across the corridors of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III walked briskly toward his private study. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors, each step carrying the weight of a decision that would shake the very foundations of the royal family. In his hand, he clutched a newspaper whose headlines screamed accusations about his beloved daughter-in-law, Catherine, Princess of Wales. Charles had always admired Kate's grace under pressure. From the moment William brought her home as his university girlfriend, she had shown remarkable poise and dignity. She never complained about the constant scrutiny, never spoke ill of anyone, and always carried herself with the quiet strength that reminded him of his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II. Today, however, that strength was being tested in ways no one could have imagined. The scandal had erupted 3 days earlier when a former palace staff member sold a story to the tabloids, claiming Kate had been difficult to work with and had made unreasonable demands. The allegations were vicious and personal, painting her as someone completely different from the woman Charles knew. The story suggested she had reduced staff members to tears, thrown tantrums about flower arrangements, and even criticized Camilla's contributions to royal duties. Charles knew these accusations were false. He had witnessed Kate's interactions with staff countless times. She remembered their names, asked about their families, and often brought small gifts when she returned from overseas trips. The idea that she would deliberately hurt anyone was absurd to him. Yet the media frenzy was growing by the hour, and he could see the toll it was taking on his son's family. William had been trying to shield Kate and their children from the worst of it, but the pressure was enormous. Catherine had not slept properly in days, barely eating, and had even suggested she might need to step back from her royal duties until the storm passed. The thought of losing Kate from the royal family, even temporarily, filled Charles with dread. She had brought a modern touch to the monarchy that connected them with younger generations. What troubled Charles most was not just the false allegations, but where he suspected they had originated. There had been whispers and cold exchanges in recent months. Camilla had never seemed entirely comfortable with Kate's growing popularity with the public. While Charles loved his wife dearly, he could not ignore the subtle signs of jealousy that had begun to surface. The queen consort had always struggled with her public image, haunted by her role in the breakdown of Charles's marriage to Diana. Despite years of dedicated service and Charles's unwavering support, a significant portion of the public still viewed her with suspicion. Kate, on the other hand, had captured hearts effortlessly. Her fairy tale romance with William, her relatable background, and her natural warmth had made her one of the most beloved members of the royal family. Charles remembered the exact moment he realized there was a problem. It was during a family dinner at Sandringham 2 months earlier. Kate had been sharing stories about her recent visit to a children's hospital, her face glowing as she described the brave young patients she had met. The room was captivated by her genuine emotion and the way she made everyone feel connected to her charitable work. But when Charles glanced at Camilla, he saw something that chilled him. His wife's smile seemed forced, her eyes distant and cold. Later that evening, he found her in their private sitting room, staring out the window with an expression he had rarely seen before. When he asked if everything was all right, she simply said that some people seemed to have everything handed to them on a silver platter. The comment puzzled him at first, but over the following weeks, he began to notice a pattern. Camilla would make subtle remarks about Kate's media coverage, questioning whether all the praise was really deserved. She would point out small mistakes or suggest that Kate's approach to certain royal duties lacked proper protocol. These comments were never made in front of others, only in their private moments, but they began to add up. Charles tried to address his concerns gently, reminding Camilla of Kate's dedication and the positive impact she had on the monarchy's image. But each conversation seemed to make things worse. Camilla would become defensive, claiming that she was only trying to maintain proper standards and that perhaps Charles was playing favorites. The situation reached a breaking point when Charles learned about a private meeting between Camilla and several senior palace staff members. According to a trusted advisor who had attended, Camilla had expressed concerns about Kate's conduct and had suggested that certain standards needed to be maintained. While she had not explicitly ordered anyone to take action, the message was clear enough. Someone in that room had decided to take matters into their own hands. Now, as Charles sat in his study reviewing the morning's brutal headlines, he felt a fury building inside him that he had not experienced in years. The attack on Kate was not just an attack on his daughter-in-law. It was an attack on the future of the monarchy itself. William and Kate represented hope, continuity, and the modernization that the royal family desperately needed to remain relevant. He thought about his grandchildren, George, Charlotte, and Louis, who would grow up seeing their mother vilified in the press. He thought about William, torn between defending his wife and maintaining family unity. Most of all, he thought about Kate herself, who had given up her privacy, her freedom, and her old life to serve the crown, only to be rewarded with betrayal from within her own family. The study door opened quietly, and his private secretary entered with a concerned expression. The morning briefing was scheduled to begin, but Charles held up his hand to signal he needed another moment. He looked out the window at the gardens where Kate often played with his grandchildren, their laughter echoing across the grounds during happier times. Making his decision, Charles reached for his phone and called William directly. His son's voice was strained when he answered, clearly exhausted from the stress of the past few days. Charles spoke with quiet authority, telling William to bring Kate to the palace immediately. There were things that needed to be said and actions that needed to be taken. After ending the call, Charles summoned his communications team and several senior advisors. If there was going to be a war of words, he intended to win it decisively. But first, there was another conversation he needed to have, one that he had been dreading but could no longer avoid. As he made his way through the palace corridors toward Camilla's private apartments, Charles felt the weight of his crown more heavily than ever before. The decisions he made in the coming hours would determine not just the fate of his family, but the future of the monarchy itself. He had protected Camilla for decades, defending her against critics and standing by her through the most difficult times. Now, for the first time in their relationship, he found himself in the impossible position of having to choose between the woman he loved and the institution he was sworn to protect. As he approached Camilla's door, he knew that regardless of what happened next, their relationship would never be the same again. The palace that had witnessed centuries of family dramas and political crises was about to see one of its most dramatic confrontations yet. And at the center of it all was a question that would echo through the corridors of power. How far would King Charles III go to defend the woman he considered the future of his monarchy? The silence that had settled over the royal household was about to be shattered, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The defense of Catherine, Princess of Wales, was about to begin in earnest, and Charles was prepared to use every tool at his disposal to protect the daughter-in-law who had become like a true daughter to him. As he raised his hand to knock on Camilla's door, Charles steeled himself for the conversation that would change everything. The time for gentle diplomacy had passed. Now was the moment for a king to show exactly where his loyalties lay, even if it meant confronting the woman who shared his throne. The morning sun continued to stream through the palace windows, but the warmth it brought could not penetrate the chill that was about to descend upon the royal family. Charles had made his choice, and there would be no turning back from the path he was about to take in defense of Kate and the future of the crown. The knock on Camilla's door was firm but respectful. Charles waited a moment before entering, finding his wife seated at her writing desk, apparently composing correspondence. She looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, sensing immediately that this was not a casual visit. "Charles, darling, you look troubled," Camilla said, setting down her pen and turning to face him fully. "I assume this is about the unfortunate business with Catherine?" Charles closed the door behind him and remained standing, a subtle but unmistakable signal that this conversation would not be conducted as equals relaxing in their private space. "I think you know exactly why I'm here, Camilla." The queen consort's expression shifted slightly, her practiced composure wavering for just a moment. "I'm not sure what you mean. If you're referring to those dreadful newspaper stories, I'm just as appalled as you are. Poor Catherine must be devastated." "Stop." Charles's voice cut through the air with quiet authority. "Please don't insult my intelligence or yours by pretending you don't know what's happening here." Camilla stood slowly, moving toward the window as if the view of the gardens might provide some escape from the conversation she had been dreading. "Charles, I understand you're upset, but I really don't know what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting that you orchestrated this attack on Kate, either directly or through your influence with the staff." Charles moved closer, his voice remaining controlled but carrying an edge that Camilla had rarely heard. "I'm suggesting that your jealousy of my daughter-in-law has finally pushed you to do something unforgivable." The accusation hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. Camilla's carefully maintained facade finally cracked, and Charles saw a flash of the anger and resentment she had been hiding for months. "Jealousy." Camilla turned from the window, her voice rising slightly. Is that what you think this is about? Some petty jealousy of a woman half my age? Then, explain it to me, Charles replied evenly. Explain why a loyal staff member suddenly decided to sell fabricated stories about Kate to the tabloids. Explain why this happened just weeks after your private meeting with senior household staff. Camilla's face flushed, confirming that Charles's information was accurate. How dare you have me watched and monitored? I am your wife, your queen consort, not some servant to be spied upon. You are my wife, Charles acknowledged, his voice softening slightly, which is why this conversation is breaking my heart. But you are also attacking the mother of my grandchildren and the future Queen of England. I cannot and will not allow that to continue. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Camilla sank back into her chair, the fight seeming to drain out of her as suddenly as it had appeared. Do you have any idea what it's like? She asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. To spend decades being hated by the public, to have every appearance scrutinized and criticized, to know that no matter what you do, you'll never be good enough. Charles felt a familiar pang of guilt and sympathy. He knew the price Camilla had paid for their love, the public hatred she had endured, the constant comparison to Diana that followed her everywhere. But his compassion could not excuse what had been done to Kate. I know it's been difficult, he said, taking a step closer. And I know I haven't always protected you the way I should have. But Kate is not your enemy, Camilla. She has never said or done anything to harm you. Hasn't she? Camilla's voice turned bitter. She doesn't have to say anything. She just has to exist, to smile for the cameras, to be young and beautiful and beloved while I'm the woman who destroyed the fairy tale. Charles moved to the chair across from her, sitting down so they could speak more directly. Catherine has worked tirelessly to support this family and this institution. She has been respectful to you, included you in family celebrations, and never once complained about the treatment she's received from the media. And for that, she's praised as a saint, Camilla shot back. When I do the same things, I'm criticized for not being Diana. When she does them, she's celebrated as the perfect princess. Do you not see how impossible that makes my position? Charles ran his hands through his hair, feeling the weight of decades of family complications pressing down on him. I see a woman who has let her pain and insecurity drive her to hurt an innocent person. I see someone who has forgotten that attacking Kate also attacks William, and George, and Charlotte, and Louis. At the mention of the children, Camilla's expression softened slightly. She had always been fond of her step-grandchildren, and the reality of how her actions might affect them seemed to hit her for the first time. I never meant for it to go this far, she admitted quietly. I thought if people saw that she wasn't perfect, that she had flaws like everyone else. You thought what? That it would make you look better by comparison? Charles's disappointment was evident in his voice. Camilla, you are 66 years old, not 16. You know better than this. The queen consort looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. The meeting with the staff wasn't supposed to result in this. I simply expressed some concerns about maintaining proper protocols. I never explicitly told anyone to go to the press. But you knew someone would, Charles said firmly. You're too intelligent to believe otherwise. You created the perfect conditions for this attack, and then maintained plausible deniability. Camilla looked up at him with tears beginning to form in her eyes. What do you want me to do, Charles? I can't take it back. The damage is already done. Charles stood again, moving to the window where she had been standing earlier. Outside, he could see the preparation for the day's activities, staff members going about their duties, unaware of the drama unfolding in the royal apartments above. You're going to help me fix this, he said without turning around. You're going to use every connection you have in the media to find out who leaked those stories and make sure they never work in London again. You're going to personally call every editor who ran those stories and express your outrage at the treatment of your daughter-in-law. Charles, I'm not finished. He turned back to face her, his expression stern but not unkind. You're going to plan a very public show of support for Kate. A joint engagement, perhaps a charity event, where the cameras can capture you treating her with the respect and affection she deserves. Camilla wiped her eyes with a handkerchief from her pocket. And if I refuse? The question hung between them like a challenge. Charles looked at the woman he had loved for decades, the woman who had stood by him through his divorce, his mother's disapproval, and public scandal. But he also thought about Kate, probably at this very moment trying to explain to her children why people were saying mean things about their mother. Then, you will discover that being queen consort is a privilege, not a right, he said quietly. And privileges can be revoked. The threat was delivered without anger, but its implications were unmistakable. Camilla could be stripped of her titles, removed from official duties, effectively exiled from the royal family, while remaining technically married to the king. You would do that to me? After everything we've been through together? Charles sat back down, reaching for her hands despite everything that had passed between them in the last few minutes. I love you, Camilla. I have loved you for most of my adult life. But I will not let you destroy this family out of jealousy and insecurity. And what about us? What about our marriage? That depends entirely on you, Charles replied honestly. If you can find a way to make peace with Kate and support her as a member of this family, then we can work through this. But if you continue to see her as a threat rather than an asset, then I'm afraid our personal relationship will have to take second place to my duties as king. The room fell silent again as Camilla processed the ultimatum she had just received. Charles could see her struggling with the decision, weighing her pride against her love for him, her resentment against the potential consequences of maintaining it. Finally, she spoke in a voice so quiet he had to strain to hear her. I'll make the calls. Charles felt a mixture of relief and sadness wash over him. Relief that the immediate crisis might be manageable, sadness that their relationship had been damaged, perhaps irreparably, by her actions and his response to them. Thank you, he said simply. Don't thank me yet, Camilla replied, standing and moving toward her desk where her personal phone sat. I'll do what you've asked, Charles, but don't expect me to like it. And don't expect Kate and me to suddenly become best friends. I don't expect friendship, Charles said, also rising. I expect civility, respect, and an end to the attacks. Kate has never done anything to deserve your hostility. As he moved toward the door, Camilla called out to him one last time. Charles. He turned back, hoping perhaps for some sign of genuine remorse or understanding. This changes things between us, you know. We can't go back to the way things were before. Charles nodded sadly. I know, but sometimes, when you're king, protecting the crown means making sacrifices, even personal ones. He left her sitting at her desk, reaching for her phone to begin the difficult work of undoing the damage she had helped create. As he walked through the palace corridors toward his own offices, Charles felt the weight of the crown more heavily than ever before. The confrontation was over, but the real work was just beginning. Now he had to figure out how to rebuild trust within his family while protecting Kate from any further attacks. The palace silence that had hidden so many secrets was about to be broken by his own voice, speaking in defense of the daughter-in-law he was determined to protect. But first, he had a phone call to make to William, and another difficult conversation to prepare for with Kate herself. The morning's events had set everything in motion, and there would be no stopping the consequences that were about to unfold throughout the royal household. William and Catherine arrived at Buckingham Palace within the hour, their faces drawn with exhaustion and worry. Charles met them personally in the private entrance, an unusual gesture that immediately signaled the gravity of the situation. As he embraced Kate, he felt her trembling slightly, and his resolve to protect her strengthened even further. Thank you for coming so quickly, Charles said, leading them toward his private study. We have much to discuss and decisions to make. Catherine looked pale but composed, her training as a royal evident even in her distress. William kept a protective arm around his wife's shoulders, his jaw set in anger that mirrored his father's own feelings about the situation. Have you seen the morning papers? William asked as they settled into comfortable chairs away from the formal seating area. They're calling for Kate to step down from her royal duties. They're questioning her fitness to be future queen. Charles nodded grimly. I've seen them all, which is why we're going to take decisive action, starting today. He spent the next 20 minutes explaining his confrontation with Camilla, watching as Kate's expression shifted from confusion to hurt to something approaching relief. The knowledge that the attacks had originated from within the family was painful, but at least now she understood why her usual strategies for dealing with negative press had been ineffective. I don't understand, Kate said quietly when Charles finished his account. I've tried so hard to be respectful to Camilla, to include her in family events, to never step on her toes. What did I do wrong? Nothing, Charles said firmly. You did absolutely nothing wrong, Catherine. This was about Camilla's own insecurities and jealousies, not about anything you did or didn't do. William's anger was visible as he processed the information. She's been sitting at our family dinners, playing grandmother to our children, while secretly orchestrating attacks on Kate. How could she do that? Because she's human, Charles replied, his voice heavy with disappointment. And humans sometimes do terrible things when they feel threatened or diminished. But understanding her motivation doesn't excuse her actions. Charles then outlined his plan for addressing the crisis. First, there would be an immediate investigation into the source of the leaked stories, with swift and public consequences for anyone found to have betrayed their position of trust. Second, there would be a coordinated media response featuring testimonials from staff members who had worked closely with Kate, countering the negative allegations with first-hand accounts of her character. But, most importantly, Charles continued, I'm going to make a personal statement, not through press releases or official communications, but directly to the people. Kate looked alarmed. Charles, you don't need to put yourself in the middle of this. I can handle. No. Charles interrupted gently but firmly. This is exactly what I need to do. As king, as your father-in-law, and as someone who believes in truth over fiction. What Charles didn't mention was the private conversation he had already scheduled with the editor of the newspaper that had run the most vicious attacks. He had learned through his connections that the editor was struggling with declining circulation and mounting debts. A few well-placed calls about advertising boycotts and exclusive access to royal stories could be very persuasive. Over the next several hours, the palace machinery moved with military precision. Charles's communications team worked to arrange interviews and statements, while his private secretaries reached out to their extensive network of contacts in media and government. The message was simple but powerful. Attacks on Catherine were attacks on the future of the monarchy itself, and would not be tolerated. By mid-afternoon, the first signs of pushback began to appear. A former Kensington Palace staff member gave an interview praising Kate's kindness and professionalism. The head of a children's charity that Kate patronized issued a strong statement defending her character and commitment. Most significantly, several prominent journalists began questioning the credibility of the original allegations. Camilla, true to her word, had begun making her own calls. Charles could hear raised voices from her apartments as she demanded retractions and apologies from editors who had run the stories. Her influence in certain circles remained considerable, and she was using every bit of it to undo the damage she had helped create. The turning point came when Charles received an unexpected visitor. Diana's former private secretary, now in her 70s but still sharp and well-connected, had requested an urgent meeting. Charles received her in the same study where he had planned Kate's defense earlier that morning. Your Majesty, she began without preamble, I've been watching the attacks on Catherine with growing alarm. They remind me uncomfortably of the campaign against Diana in the early days of her troubles. Charles felt a chill run down his spine. The parallels had not escaped him, but hearing them spoken aloud by someone who had lived through that nightmare made them more real and more frightening. I've brought something that might be useful, she continued, producing a folder from her handbag. Letters from staff members who worked with Diana, explaining how similar false allegations were used to isolate and destabilize her. I thought the comparison might be instructive for your media strategy. Charles accepted the folder with gratitude, but also with a growing sense of urgency. If the same tactics that had been used against Diana were being employed against Kate, then the threat was even more serious than he had initially realized. That evening, Charles made his move. Rather than a formal statement or press conference, he chose a more personal approach. He attended a charity gala that Kate was scheduled to participate in, an event that she had been considering canceling due to the negative publicity. When the royal car arrived at the venue, Charles stepped out first, then personally escorted Kate from the car, his arm linked through hers in a gesture of unmistakable support and affection. The photographers, who had been expecting to capture images of a beleaguered princess, instead found themselves documenting a powerful show of family unity. Inside the venue, Charles made his feelings even clearer. During his speech to the gathered donors and charity workers, he spoke with genuine emotion about Kate's dedication to her charitable work and her importance to the future of the monarchy. The Princess of Wales, he said, looking directly at Kate as she sat in the front row, represents everything that is best about modern Britain and modern monarchy. Her compassion, her dedication, and her grace under pressure remind me daily why I have such confidence in the future of our institution. The applause was thunderous, but, more importantly, the cameras captured every word and every gesture. By the late evening news broadcasts, the narrative had shifted completely. Instead of a story about allegations against Kate, the media was covering the king's unprecedented public defense of his daughter-in-law. The next morning brought a dramatic change in the newspaper coverage. Several publications that had run critical stories now featured front-page retractions and apologies. The staff member who had sold the original story was identified and dismissed from his position, with legal action pending. Most significantly, the editor of the newspaper that had led the attack published a personal apology, citing serious questions about the reliability of our sources. Kate called Charles before 8 in the morning, her voice lighter than it had been in days. "I don't know how to thank you," she said simply. "You don't need to thank me," Charles replied. "Your family, Catherine. This is what family does." But the aftermath was more complex than simple gratitude. Charles's relationship with Camilla remained strained, their interactions formal and distant. She had fulfilled her promise to help undo the damage, but the trust between them had been fundamentally damaged. They continued to live as husband and wife, to appear together at official functions, but the easy intimacy they had once shared was gone. Camilla herself seemed to recognize that she had crossed a line from which there could be no complete return. She began making more effort with Kate, including her more deliberately in conversations and family events, but there was a forced quality to her attempts at reconciliation that fooled no one. Kate, for her part, accepted Camilla's overtures with grace and dignity, but she was no longer naive about the dynamics within the royal family. She had learned that even within the supposedly protective walls of the palace, she would need to be constantly vigilant about protecting herself and her children. William was perhaps the most changed by the events. His anger toward Camilla was slow to fade, and his protectiveness of Kate intensified. He began taking a more active role in palace communications and security decisions, determined to prevent any future attacks on his wife. Charles found himself occupying an uncomfortable middle ground, working to maintain family unity while ensuring that the lessons of the crisis were not forgotten. He increased Kate's security detail and gave her more input into palace staffing decisions. He also established new protocols for handling negative media coverage, ensuring that future attacks would be met with swift and decisive responses. 6 months later, as Charles watched Kate playing with his grandchildren in the palace gardens, he reflected on the events that had tested his family so severely. The immediate crisis had been resolved, the attacks had been defeated, and Kate's reputation had been not just restored but enhanced by the obvious support of the king himself. But the deeper issues remained. The jealousies and insecurities that had driven Camilla to her destructive actions had not disappeared, merely been suppressed. The media's willingness to publish unverified attacks on royal family members had been temporarily curtailed but not eliminated. And the pressure on Kate, as the future queen, would only increase as time went on. Charles knew that his defense of Kate had been successful in the short term, but it had also established a precedent. He had shown that he was willing to risk his personal relationships and use the full power of his position to protect the future of the monarchy. It was a power he hoped he would never need to use again, but one he would not hesitate to employ if necessary. As he watched his grandchildren laugh and play, he felt a sense of satisfaction mixed with melancholy. He had protected Catherine, defended the crown, and preserved the future of his family's dynasty. But the cost had been higher than he had anticipated, and the scars from the battle would be visible for years to come. The palace silence had been broken not by Camilla's screams, as some might have expected, but by Charles's own voice, speaking clearly and decisively in defense of the woman he saw as crucial to the monarchy's future. And in that voice, the entire royal household had heard an unmistakable message. King Charles III would protect his family and his crown, no matter what personal sacrifices that protection might require. The crisis was over, but its lessons would echo through the corridors of Buckingham Palace for generations to come.